for women, it really goes deep. And women have these really deep-seated feelings about their voices, and often kind of a feeling maybe from their past that they've carried with them that they should be quiet or they're not good enough or their voice, is ugly and they don't like it. And I ask that at the start of every workshop, do you love your voice? And nobody ever raises their hand. And that's what I wanted to change.
Right. I took a communications class in college, and at the final, the final basically was we had to stand up, and she videotaped it. We had to stand up in front of the class and give a presentation. And then we all got to critique each other. And it was really fun. Um, and one of the girls, when she stood up, she was very short. And then when she stood up and gave her presentation, she had a pretty high pitched voice. And the teacher, it was very tough feedback, but I thought it was really helpful. The teacher said to her, you have a bigger challenge in front of you because your voice is high pitched and it sounds really young, and that's going to be something that get judged, or people are going to automatically think certain things. And so it was fascinating because I'm sure that was extremely hard for her to hear, but also important because that's probably not true. People do judge if you have, especially if you're a woman, if you have a really high pitched voice or a really raspy voice. Like, it seems like that is definitely something people take notice of.
Right, all that's true. And a lot of that is because we're often told that women's voices, we get these messages from our culture that women's voices are not quite right, especially in leadership areas.
Yeah.
And you hear this on the political scene too. You hear words like shrill and klaxon and annoying and grating and whiny, and there's this huge laundry list. But really, what it comes down to is that when we're used to hearing people speaking in public, we're used to hearing men.
Yes.
And so when you women in those same positions, and it could be on the political stump or it could be in the boardroom, if a woman sounds less in that male pattern speech that you were so used to hearing, it often gets flagged. And so if your voice sounds higher, then you sound often even less like a guy.
Yeah.
And that's going to be a strike against you. And I think, here's the thing. I think that will change as we get more toward equity in areas of gender and other areas of diversity. We're going to have more of an acceptance of diverse voices too. And that might mean you don't have to sound like this, like a man anymore when you speak.
Yeah. Did you have you heard about Elizabeth Holmes? She was the CEO of Theranos, obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so basically there was this great podcast called The Dropout, and they talk about how she lowered her voice to sound more like, I think it was specifically to sound like more like a man, but she also started to kind of dress like Steve Jobs. And there's things on the internet where they will show her voice before versus her voice when she was trying, and she lowered, as you said, like women's voices. It's really a comparison to how it sounds to a man.
Right, that's so interesting, that Elizabeth Holmes story that came out, and people really had these strong reactions.
Yeah.
And at the core of all of that conversation is, you know, what do we think about a woman who changes her voice? Is she allowed to change her voice, and why does she change it? And I think it's totally fine to change your voice if you feel like it doesn't reflect who you are on the inside. And I work with a lot of women in my coaching business who come to me and they just don't feel right. They say, I do public speaking, but the voice I hear when I speak does not reflect the power. It's usually power that they feel inside that they don't think is being communicated. And so then if they want to work with their voice and change it to sound like something that reflects who they are in the inside, I say go for it, and I help them do it. But if it's being kind of pushed from the outside by someone saying, you don't sound right. In fact, there's an interesting anecdote in the Steve Jobs, his daughter's autobiography, about how he went out to dinner and he critiqued the cousin's voice and said, your voice isn't right. You should fix your voice. And so if that's the kind of criticism that's coming at you, then you're never going to have a good relationship no matter what change you make with your voice. Mm-hmm. So I think as long as it's coming from you and it's coming from a place of positivity and empowerment, why not?
Right.
You know, we don't tell athletes, don't try to run faster, don't try to be stronger. Of course we don't. So why can't we work with our voice?
That's a good point. Well, you're clearly an expert on this, which is probably why you recently wrote a book called Outspoken, Why Women's Voices Get Silenced and How to Set Them Free. But I mean, was it just really, you felt like I've got all this information to share, I've got to write this book and it needs out there? I mean, why now write the book?
Oh my gosh, I feel like this is exactly the right time. We're waking up to the fact that women's voices get sidelined. We have this whole language for it now, which I think is just mind-blowing. Have you heard the word mansplaining, for example?
Yep, definitely.
Yeah, and manspreading and manpropriating. There are all these experiences that women have had kind of to describe the experience of speaking while female. And a lot of women are going, you know what? I am sidelining my voice. Even I discovered that at the beginning of this journey, that, yeah, there were moments when I was shutting down because it's just not what we expect women to do, to add their voice. And so I do try to urge women to get out there and share their voices. And at the same time as all of that, there's all this research that's piling up about women who are interrupted on the U.S. Supreme Court, about women being seen as less competent if they speak more often in the boardroom. There's a huge wealth of research that shows, you know what, women, we are not crazy.
Yeah.
This is what it's like to speak as a woman in our culture. And as long as we know about it, we can support each other. We can share our stories. We can amplify each other's voices. There's something we can do, and I feel like the moment is absolutely now. And I wanted to seize that moment and get in there and help.
Yes. You mentioned research, and I know when I was kind of researching this topic and getting ready for the interview with your book, it was that researchers found that female executives who speak more often than their peers are rated 14% less competent, while male executives who do the same enjoy a 10% competency bump. And it was like, what? What? Just because their voices? Is it? It has. As you said, it's probably not just their voice; it's the confidence, it's all the things, because all these pieces go together, right?
Oh yeah, and that's exactly the right reaction. You read this, and the first time you hear it, it does blow your mind, and not in a good way. And you're going, "What's going on here?" And that research you're referencing, it comes from Yale University, and the researcher looked at what happened. She created these scenarios with hypothetical male executives and hypothetical female executives. And then she asked respondents in her study to say, well, if this woman talks more than her peers, how do you rate her competency? And if this man does the same thing, what happens to him? And as you said, his competency rating goes up, hers goes down a lot. And so as a woman, if you're in that spot in your career and you're sensing that things just don't feel right when I speak, what's happening, and you're staying quiet out of fear, well, maybe you're right, because again, you're not crazy. We have data to show that this is actually going on, because we're just not used to hearing women's voices in those places of power, and we're not giving women license to speak with the same frequency and volubility that we give men. And we don't give ourselves that either, because it's not the pattern that we grew up seeing.
Right.
I was thinking about it as I was writing this book. Like, I grew up watching nature documentaries a lot on PBS, and they were always narrated by men. And it never occurred to me that a woman could narrate a PBS nature documentary. It never even occurred to me. It was just the wallpaper. And so that's what I mean, where we're starting to just finally wake up to this.